But second, and this is a problem, this is a real problem with the BBC at the moment, they have a praiseworthy desire to give a balanced presentation. And in fact, they get very much in a twitter if someone says, oh, you're being unbalanced. And they think being balanced means two sides, and they really have Match of the Day confused with science reporting. And so they'll get an incident that's really, you know, pick a really good, the Italian soccer team playing the local high school, and that's two sides as far as in what many of these scientific issues are. It often can seriously misrepresent the science, where one side is firmly established thing and the other side is basically a travelling road show of crackpots. And one very clear example is, does HIV cause AIDS? There is still a travelling roadshow that you can bring on board if you're Mbeki in South Africa, including a Nobel laureate who will be one side that's saying HIV doesn't cause AIDS, and then there'll be a couple of 100,000 medical people. And there was a time in the mid-80s when alternative ideas deserved exploration, but they don't now. It's all very well to say, given the knowledge and the uncertainty, you manage risks proportionately, but as we're all aware, objective assessment of risks, when it can be done, and it can't always be done accurately, often is very much at odds with subjective impressions. And so you get a plane crash. My favourite example is when the Lockerbie disaster happened, and huge numbers of people in North America cancelled their trip to Europe and drove across America instead. I mean, the risk is, in that case, about 100 times greater. But it seems safer if you're the person behind the wheel. I myself am subject to that delusion. So that's another problem in these. And although I didn't go in detail into all the subtext of the things when I put up the initial set of protocols, but one of the ways out of this is to say, where possible, as for example with GM foods, just label things clearly and let people exercise choice. If it's something that's purely personal, doesn't work for everything. I mean, you cannot say that about if you don't like your kid being vaccinated, then it's up to you, personal choice. You can't sensibly say that, because here, by not having your child vaccinated and assuming that's okay because we don't have to worry about measles anymore, you are relying on everybody else having their kid vaccinated so that your kid's safe. And if enough people take that route, then your kid isn't safe. And we've done that in this country. But even so, there is a problem with the label and choose. There's that kind of problem. There's the problem of young people who really, well, the slide says it all. Broadly, what I have been sketching to you is an idealised vision to attack the problem I outlined right at the beginning of a process of public debate about contentious issues in which a drama is enacted on a stage which is set and constrained by scientific facts and acknowledged uncertainties. And in that, science has a special voice. The drama that's played out on the stage is then a drama of democratic choice. And science has no special voice there, although we would wish science to be engaged as citizen scientists. And this, however, that process works best, and it will never work ideally, but it works best first when a substantial fraction of the population are motivated to become engaged, which in turn requires that there are some clear benefits to be set against possible worries. So in the GM debate, we had the problem that there were some strident opponents, but for the general public, particularly in the aftermath of BSE, there were no significant benefits. So the sensible decision, in many ways, seemed to be Well, let's just have none of it. Whereas had there been, the trouble is, unlike the Green Revolution, which was done with public money and oriented to consumers, the GM revolution, for different reasons, was mainly created with private money, and the first wave of products were of benefit to agribusiness rather than the consumer. As we get products that are going to be more benefit to the consumer, I believe the fuss we still have in Europe will in 20 years or so be a dim memory, the subject of social science theses. Even if you can have the debate right, you then have to have a legislative process that reflects the public will. And what we did with embryonic stem cell research was an illustration of how things can work if you do it well. We had a very wide debate. We had the science community engaged in setting the stage and sketching the possible benefits. We had quite a bit of opposition, ideological opposition. But basically, it was clear the public, on balance, were in favour of it, and that was reflected in free votes in both houses. Votes of the general 1/3, 2/3, 40, 60. Interestingly, polls in North America suggest that if you had a free vote in North America, you'd get exactly the same result. Even if you ask born-again Christians, more are in favour of embryonic stem cell research than against it. But the fascist wing of right-wing so-called Christianity that I don't know what Christ would make of it if he had the misfortune. There's this wonderful joke, I don't know, when that wonderful lady who was the running for vice president was on television, and it was then parodied in one of the things, but she confessed, she said she was really looking forward to the day when the end of days, rapture, and meeting Jesus. And the interviewer says, hasn't he suffered enough? I digress. And interesting, in the US, the bias from influential money streams and campaign donors and the hard right has meant that there was no chance of putting through legislation similar to ours, despite the fact that public opinion is very similar to ours. So there are lots of problems in the way of executing these things. And I'll just give you a few amusing illustrations from recent years here. Perhaps my favourite, because it's a happy story. In the wake of BSE, there's a really interesting question. Has the prion hopped back, this particular rogue prion variant of Scrapie, hopped back into the sheep population? And if so, will it pose a risk to us? Well, this was posed to John Krebs when he was head of the Food Standards Agency, and he went on television and he explained, he said the experiments to try and test whether it has have been a bit of a cock-up, frankly. When he came off, incidentally, his officials said, Sir John, you can't use words like cock-up on television. And he said, well, Bob May does it all the time. And they said, oh, but he's Australian. Which confirmed one of my beliefs that being an Australian could be used to your advantage. I once said to my wife, being an Australian has the great advantage, no one puts you in one of these class boxes. She said, being Australian has the advantage of so crass you don't notice which box they put you in. But anyhow, so John went on television, he said, there is no evidence that it has, but the statistical power of the evidence we have is such you can't rule it out. And if it has, we can't rule out the possibility that it could create a problem. He was the next day, the relevant minister, whom I kindly will not name, was on a tantrum. He said, you've got to tell them it's all right. John just brandished the protocols. The effect was there was a depression of about 1% in lamb sales around that time. I am thoroughly convinced that if John had done what the minister was instructing him to do, and gone and sort of fed himself a lamb burger, as it were, at least one of the media, quite rightly, would have stirred up a whole new big fuss. Now that was an example of the thing working. Another example of the thing eventually working is the Health Minister, Milburn, who decided it would be very politically good to say, on Department of Health committees, no representative of big pharmaceuticals shall sit on a committee. Now, this is crazy. Of course, you should identify the interest. You should identify the various other interests that will be there around the table, the various NGOs, but furthermore, it'll exclude a whole source of expertise. Again, this led to an interesting quarrel in which Tony Blair was brought in to intervene to say this contravenes the guidelines.